I got out of the Army on a Friday afternoon and applied to the CIA on a Monday morning and was in my career trainee class where I met my wife 90 days later.
From what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but you and your wife were one of the first clandestine couples that also mentored other couples in the CIA?
Yes. So we entered our career trainee class in January of 1971. Tended to be very gender specific. So in our entry class, there were 25 guys and 2 ladies. So my wife was one of the very first female career trainees.
I mean, shout out to her. You know, this reminds me of, I know you're familiar with Andrew Bustamante. He's been making the rounds for the past 2 years on YouTube. You're talking about CIA. And he also met his wife in the CIA. Is that like a really common thing?
It is. And some wags have called it the world's most expensive dating service because you figure you're working 10, 12, 14 hours a day.
Right.
You're not allowed to talk very much about what it is that you do to the outside world. Everybody that you're working with tend to be doing the same kinds of things and have the same backgrounds and interests. So yes, there have been a lot of marriages inside the agency.
You know, this is not something I was thinking about, but now that we're talking about this, Chris and I, you know, we work a lot, right? And we're in a relationship where my wife and his fiance, where they also work a ton. So we're constantly working, kind of like similar to what you're saying about couples at CIA. Is there any advice you can give a couple that both, you know, individuals are working a ton? What can they do to overcome being absent a lot of the time?
Well, you're missing a detail. He's missing one detail that I think is important.
Yeah, what is that?
Our spouses travel a lot.
That's right. That's right.
So yes, in fact, because my wife and I were one of the first what we call tandem couples in the agency, and there were many more professional women being hired after us, and many more tandem couples. In the early days, my wife and I actually did a lot of counseling and mentoring for tandem couples, and there is some very good advice in this regard. First of all, talk.
Communication.
Both sides have to be on the same page.
Okay.
You can't assume anything. And then there need to be a lot of mutual support, a lot of sharing, a lot of consideration given to the other person's career. Is one person's career going to take the lead over the other?
And you bring up a really good point, and I think these are 2 challenges that Andrew and myself have both faced.
Definitely.
It's easy for me as a project manager. I can go to any city and find work. As a real estate agent, he builds his network in a city, and that's basically his paycheck is the connections he's made in a city. It is possible to go to another city, but it's almost like starting from square one again in a lot of cases. For me, it was easy for me to relocate. Andrew and his spouse have to face that decision, but I think it's a lot more difficult for him to get up and leave.
Definitely. I definitely see that. So when I like to travel with my wife for when she goes on assignment for work, if I'm available, I definitely do it. But it's like Chris is saying, so whenever she goes somewhere, I Google the best bars, the best places people like to come together, and I try and find clients and I pick up clients. It's very strange because I go to the bar and I immediately get a phone number. My wife knows I've gotten very good at this. I don't know. Sometimes I'm like, maybe I could have been a good CIA agent, but
yeah. Sounds like a basic skill to me.
3 balls, 2 strikes, pressure is on. This is where we discuss real estate, property improvement, and business. Together, we'll strategize on how to win. Welcome to the Full Count.
Welcome to Full Count Podcast. We have Jim Hughes on today. He's a former CIA and NSA officer, and we are so excited to have him on. Jim, we went through your background a little bit, and it is so impressive. And I think the podcast for the audience is going to be great because they're going to be able to see how to overcome pressure when it comes to a high-stakes scenario. So with that said, I'm going to go over your background real quick. Former senior CIA operations officer and NSA associate deputy director of operations. He's held numerous senior management positions at CIA headquarters, served in a variety of countries in the Middle East, including as chief of station in several locations. Currently serves as president of AFIO, Association of Former Intelligence Officers, which is a nonprofit, apolitical, and educational organization. Jim, that's quite a lot of experience there and leadership.
Well, it helps if you're older. Pleasure to be with you. I look forward to talking to you and to your audience today.
Thank you. It's an honor to have you here. I really think this is going to hone in on people's ability to just become better overall, because in the private sector and personal life, we all go through some form of trauma, I guess you could say, with stress and anxiety. And I think with your tips here today, you can do that. So what do you believe a skill that you acquired at CAA is something that you've been able to use that skill set when it comes to personal life or even the private sector now that you've been retired?
If I may, I really like to address this remark to potential employers of former CIA officers. First of all, the CIA workforce is a very diverse, very experienced workforce with a lot of knowledge and a lot of skill. And we have so many different professions inside the agency that we get a lot of people with a lot of different skill sets. But in general, I would say that CIA officers have very strong interpersonal skills. Mm-hmm. They have very good communication skills, both oral and written. They are very good at assessing situations, both individual people and situations. They are very good at preparing for situations, doing the right kind of research, mm-hmm. Going into a situation well-informed so that it's a better engagement. They are particularly good at working alone, but also working in teams. And when we get into the description of what it's like to be in a station and what station officers do, I'll give you some examples of an individual officer working alone, but then coming back into the station and working with the team effectively. So
it sounds like for the most part, they have to be, before they even get in and go through all the training, they have to be a very dynamic individual that kind of can, take on multiple types of skill sets.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, the application and vetting process is very competitive.
Right.
The agency gets over 100,000 applications a year. We only take a few hundred.
Wow.
And so there is a very selective process of written exams, oral exams, mm-hmm. interviews, psych exams, because we want to make sure that this person is both in terms of knowledge, but also background and emotional stability, able to take on what are going to be some fairly tough assignments.
Right. At what point did you join the CIA, by the way? And in terms of like going undercover yourself, I know you're going to cover some other, positions of people that you've maybe met, but more so yourself, like undercover, how was that? And how did you overcome essentially not getting caught, I guess you could say?
Yeah. So this will be a little bit of a history lesson. Joined the U.S. Army Intelligence in 1967 at the height of the buildup of the Vietnam War. Went through Army intelligence training. I was not deployed to Vietnam. I was deployed to Germany, just the luck of the draw. But I also had done a junior year abroad at the University of Munich, so I had good German. So they sent me to West Berlin, and I did cross-border operations into East Germany for about 2.5 years. And then literally, I got out of the Army on a Friday afternoon and applied to the CIA on a Monday morning and was in my career trainee class where I met my wife 90 days later.
Wow. And you still, so is that why you remember on Friday that you went in? Because that's kind of the step towards your wife?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember getting out of the Army, and then I literally traveled down to the Washington area. And on Monday morning, I walked into the overt recruiter with my application form all filled out and applied.
That's a great story. I think I've also, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but you and your wife were one of the first clandestine couples that also mentored other couples in the CIA?
Yes. So we entered our career trainee class in January of 1971. And hiring back in those days for the entire U.S. government, but also for the CIA, tended to be very gender specific. So in our entry class, there were 25 guys and 2 ladies. So my wife was one of the very first female career trainees. I'm happy to say that today it's 50-50.
That is good.
I mean, shout out to her. This reminds me of, I know you're familiar with Andrew Bustamante. He's been making the rounds for the past 2 years on YouTube. You're talking about CIA, and he also met his wife in the CIA. Is that like a really common thing?
It is. And some wags have called it the world's most expensive dating service, because you figure you're working 10, 12, 14 hours a day.
Right.
You're not allowed to talk very much about what it is that you do to the outside world. Everybody that you're working with tend to be doing the same kinds of things and have the same backgrounds and interests. So yes, there have been a lot of marriages inside the agency.
This is not something I was thinking about, but now that we're talking about this, Chris and I, we work a lot, right? And we're in a relationship where my wife and his fiance, where they also work a ton. So we're constantly working, kind of like similar to what you're saying about couples at CIA. Is there any advice you can give a couple that both, individuals are working a ton? What can they do to overcome being absent a lot of the time?
Well, you're missing a detail. He's missing one detail that I think is important.
Yeah, what is that?
Our spouses travel a lot.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
So yes, in fact, because my wife and I, one of the first what we call tandem couples in the agency, and there were many more professional women being hired after us, and many more tandem couples. In the early days, my wife and I actually did a lot of counseling and mentoring for tandem couples, and there is some very good advice in this regard. First of all, talk.
Communication.
Both sides have to be on the same page.
Okay.
You can't assume anything. And then there need to be a lot of mutual support, a lot of sharing, a lot of consideration given to the other person's career. Is one person's career going to take the lead over the other? Or are you going to take
That's hard.
turns?
Mm-hmm.
There's no right answer here.
Yeah.
It's whatever you decide, but you may have to be very consistent and thoughtful, and you really have to be checking off all the time. When we get into overseas assignments and we talk about cover, I mean, if you have a family, you're taking your family with you.
Right.
And you rely on your family for your physical and operational security. They have to be part of the package. And if they're not on board, it's not going to be a success.
And you bring up a really good point, and I think these are two challenges that Andrew and myself have both faced.
Definitely.
Easy for me as a project manager. I can go to any city and find work. As a real estate agent, he builds his network in a city, and that's basically his paycheck is the connections he's made in a city. Mm-hmm. It is possible to go to another city, but it's almost like starting from square one again in a lot of cases. For me, it was easy for me to relocate. Andrew and his spouse have to face that decision, but I think it's a lot more difficult for him to get up and leave.
Definitely. I definitely see that. So when I like to travel with my wife for when she goes on assignment for work, if I'm available, I definitely do it. But it's like Chris is saying, I'm always at the point in my career where if she needs to move somewhere, I probably will have to move. So whenever she goes somewhere, I Google the best bars, the best places people like to come together, and I try and find clients and I pick up clients. It's very strange because I go to the bar and I immediately get a phone number. My wife knows I've gotten very good at this. I don't know. Sometimes I'm like, maybe I could have been a good CIA agent, but
yeah. Sounds like a basic skill to me.
Yeah. So it's been interesting. So it's really cool that you brought this up and have mentored other couples because maybe Chris and I will call you at some point if we need some help. That's okay with you.
One additional complication for us, because we were the overseas component of the agency, we had extended periods of time overseas. Now, since my wife was also working for the agency, there were things that we had to manage in that regard. But if the other spouse doesn't work for the agency, and in the early days, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, particularly in the third world, there weren't a lot of very sophisticated jobs for the other spouse to do. Right. If someone was a school teacher or a nurse, that was easy. But a lot of the other more sophisticated jobs, there just either wasn't a job market for it, or the local certification processes were so stiff that it was very hard to get through that process in a regular 2 or 3 year tour. So that tended to be an additional complication and one that had to be worked through, right, ideally in advance.
Now, what was undercover like? And if you can, I don't know if you can, how much details you can give, but I know you served time in the Middle East. You speak multiple languages. I'm sure you had to get involved in the culture to some degree. What was that all about?
Let me talk about language and area knowledge just quickly, and then I'll jump into cover. So one of the principal criteria for employment in the agency is foreign languages, particularly hard foreign languages, and what we call area knowledge skill. As I think you know, Andrew, my parents were Christian missionaries in the Middle East about 60 years ago. I actually grew up in the Middle East as a teenager, went to an Arab prep school in Beirut, and I was the only American, the only non-Arab in the boarding department. So while the curriculum was in English and French, after hours it was all in Arabic. Language is a cornerstone, but it doesn't end with language. It's also history, culture, social norms, religion. Because you're going to be successful at what we do, you really have to understand that person's motivation.
Right.
You really have to walk their street in their shoes in order to identify with them and their motivations and be at all successful in recruiting them for espionage. So for us, the foreign language, particularly hard foreign language and area knowledge skill is a critical element of success. In terms of cover, and I'll drop into jargon just for a moment, there are basically two kinds of cover. There's cover for status and cover for action. Covers for status is just, how are you going to be there? You know, where are you going to live? How are you going to drive a car? Where are you going to work? How are you going to send your kids to school? Get your mail? I mean, just all of the normal building blocks of life. That's your cover for status. Cover for action can be the same, or it can be different. And that's the identity and the cover that you would use to make an actual approach, to develop an asset, to recruit an asset, to run an asset. Many times in my career, I would have cover for status in one country, go to a third country, change identities, change cover, go to another country, and approach that potential asset or recruit and handle that potential asset. That was my cover for action.
Okay. Now, how complicated can that be, though, considering, like you were saying, you were at some point you had cover for status, other points you didn't. Is there like a checklist that you go through? Like, what kind of process?
It can be pretty complicated.
Right.
If you're in a fairly benign, friendly environment, it's not as complicated. If you're in a more hostile work environment, it can be a lot more complicated. And your family is part of that component because they need to live that cover too. Right. And so if you're in a very hostile environment, which we were on a number of occasions, you end up doing 6-8 hours of cover work a day.
Wow. That's all research and
just to justify your being there, right?
Yeah.
And then evenings and weekends, you do your other work.
So was your wife, for the most part, at some points with you at these points? Like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the movie with Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie?
Well, not quite that exciting, but almost. We were fairly young. We were only 25 and a half when we entered on duty. Okay. And my wife was actually the first one to deploy because she's a native German speaker. And we had just gone through this very sophisticated kind of high octane training. So we actually did, each of us, 2 tours separately. And then after the end of our second tours, we married, and then we were always together.
That's
and then
cool.
When we had children, our children were always with us. And I'm happy to say that we were always able to be deployed together. We were never forced to be separated.
Right. At that point, would you say, when you were with your wife and your kids were with you and you guys were moving around, were you at that point the chief of station or no? Like, did you cover that? Like, was your family with you at that time when you were chief of station?
It started before I became a chief of station because you don't become a chief of station instantly. You need to have a number of kind of working tours to become a journeyman and demonstrate your abilities in a number of different areas before you are made a chief of station. So my wife was with me. We had a first child before I became a chief of station. Then I became the chief of station. We had a second child, and we had other assignments.
Can you go over what a chief of station particularly means?
Sure. A chief of station is COS, is the most senior U.S. intelligence officer in the country. and he or she is responsible for all personnel, all assets, all intelligence activities, and all intelligence relationships in that country.
Okay, so that is impressive to say the least, for sure. You being a leader, though, was there what kind of tips can you give as a leadership position to that extent where you're in a hostile environment, and any other forms of I'm sure you might have had a decision making in terms of choosing the select team members to be deployed with you, or was that something from the higher ups maybe that might have done something like that?
So first of all, just for any assignment, even though the CIA's operational training is world class, and we have to successfully complete that training and be certified, the operational training goes on. In a first, second, third tour, station management is working with you literally on a daily basis. Who are you seeing tonight? How are you prepared for that meeting? Come back from the meeting. How did it go? What did he tell you? What did you do? All kind of stuff. So the training continues. It doesn't end with the initial segment of training. There's also specialized training for chiefs of station, and you have to be certified for that as well before you're eligible. Mm-hmm. And then for each assignment, we also do a lot of study. So I know a lot about the Middle East because I grew up in the Middle East and I do a lot of reading, but when I would be given a particular country for my future assignment, I would do a lot more reading and really understand, the history, the culture, the sociology of that particular place, even before I got there. And then, of course, that learning component continues. And we require that of all of our officers. Who is assigned to your station is kind of a shared responsibility between the chief of station and headquarters management. Mm-hmm. There are some key factors. First of all, I would say trust is number one. Because when we send an officer out to develop or handle an asset, we don't send a squad. In most cases, we don't even send two people. We send one.
Wow.
Right? And so we have to have a lot of trust and confidence in that individual to do what he or she has been trained to do,
right?
What station management has instructed them to do, and then come back and tell us truthfully what happened.
Now
so
that is a lot of trust. Then you're talking massive trust. So for me, for example, as you know, I'm a realtor and I'm a solo agent right now. I am trying to eventually form a team. I tend to have this natural nature to be very optimistic about everyone, give everyone the benefit of the doubt. But at the same time, I always try and keep myself accountable and be like, well, a lot of people, whether they're good or bad, whether you believe in that or not, which I do, people are going to be going after their self-interest. So I try to tailor to their self-interest and find people and select them, go through questionnaires. And I'm kind of forming this process right now, like an interview process to eventually get people on my team. What kind of advice could you give someone like myself or anyone else that wants to get a loyal, trustworthy, competent individual on their team while you're the particular person like you were leading the group? Because I need to know this for my sake.
So when I talked about the various generic skills that agency officers have, one of the ones that I mentioned was a real talent at assessing individuals and situations. And there is some training that we get in this category, but a lot of it's native. And being able to size up an individual, a situation, understanding them and their background and where they're coming from is an essential skill. And once you have it, you basically don't turn it off. It's always on.
Okay.
You look at a person's background, their motivations, why do they want the job? Clearly we have egos, but our egos have to be secondary to the service that we are rendering for the nation. We can't put ourselves first. We have to put the nation first. So if someone is too ambitious, or too self-serving, that tends to be a red flag for us. But we always look at backgrounds, experience, what can they do? Later in my career, when I worked in the private sector, you always look at the resume. But I got to tell you, after the first job interview, nobody asks you where you went to school or what your GPA was.
That's true.
What they ask you is, what can you do?
Yeah.
And how well can you do it? Right?
Right.
Because that's what you're looking for, is you're looking for skill sets and experience. And in a good job interview, the interviewer says, well, give me some examples of what you did and how you did it. How did you solve that problem?
Right. I think I wish I knew the acronym, what it means.
SMART.
It's called the STAR technique.
Oh, STAR technique.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with it, Chris?
I've been through a couple STAR interviews before.
Okay. I've been going through that. It basically, like you said, Jim, you ask questions and you get to see what they can do, but they have to formulate their sentences in a manner that they can actually explain it quickly without like stuttering, I guess, and make it simple, stupid in a way where in my opinion, when someone can explain something at a very basic level that the other person that has no idea what that subject's about, if they can understand it pretty well, that person probably knows what they're talking about to some degree. Of course, you got to press them and ask additional questions, but yeah.
So the STAR method, it stands for situation. So you want to set the scene and give the necessary details of your example. Task, which is describe what your responsibility was in that situation. Action, explain exactly what step you took to address it. And result, share what outcomes your actions achieved. The STAR method.
Okay, there we go. That's it. I've been reviewing that, Jim, so I've been trying to figure that out a little bit, and what you're talking about. So it also sounds to me, though, that you mentioned about understanding people's, I guess, personality, their egos, how much they have of that. So would it also be a matter of compartmentalizing and finding out where to like plot them in, like where their personality falls in, and then see if you can utilize that personality for a specific role? And how do you do that?
That's an excellent question. I mentioned earlier on that the agency workforce is a very diverse workforce. And that's not an accident. That's something that we have very purposefully done over the years. And it's because the personalities that we are trying to approach and the situations that we are working in are so diverse that not every individual is the best choice for every situation or every target. And so we want a very diverse workforce that gives us the best possible person for that particular situation.
Yeah, I like Jeff Bezos's quote on "There's 1,000 ways to be a genius." Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I didn't know you were still going on there, but that's kind of similar to what you're saying.
And I think one of the real challenges for any manager, but this was definitely true when I was in the agency, was knowing your people, knowing what their skills are, and then trying to match up the best person for that particular job, for that situation. I will tell you, in the beginning, I was not particularly good at it. I think I learned as I went and got better at it as time went by. But that is a real challenge, because in any organization, if you got a dozen people working for you, you're not going to have a dozen A+ people. You're going to have some Bs and some Cs and maybe even a couple of Ds, but you need them all to get the job done. And it's assessing them and assessing the situation and how do I match up the right person with the right job to have the most effective workforce and the most effective outcome. That can be a very challenging leadership task.
And that makes sense why people need to have that leadership experience, because day one as leader, you're not going to be the best. It takes many years. That's probably how you became chief of station. You probably had other roles, which I'm sure, of leadership positions, and then it took you all the way to the highest at chief of station, right? Overseas is what I imagine. So I know at that time, I would imagine your ability to hone in on not feeling stress and anxiety, maybe shaking or your voice cracking. I'm sure you went past that and got through it by the time you were chief of station. But at the point where, at the very beginning of your career doing clandestine work, what kind of tips can you give, someone like myself or Chris or people listening and watching to be able to overcome those stress indicators that people can essentially see. Because me, myself, I have situations all the time where I have to show a house where I don't know much about the house sometimes, and I have an audience watching every word I'm saying, and they're seeing my body manners of what I'm doing, and it can be very, very difficult. I've learned a little bit of what to do, and number one is preparation, but sometimes you don't have preparation. So what can you share?
Well, really good training and certification help. Preparation really helps. Experience helps. So you got to have a first job at some point, right?
Right.
But you learn from your mistakes. You learn from your mentors. You tuck all those lessons away and you apply them appropriately in the future. I've also got to tell you that my secret weapon is my wife. She is very, very smart. And
Okay.
I had the benefit of sharing my marriage with somebody who really understood the business very well. And when I was skirting too close to the edge, she always pulled me back.
I see. Okay.
Because we tend to be risk takers.
Right.
You kind of have to do that in order to be successful in our careers. But you don't want to be so risky that you're putting yourself and others in danger. There's kind of a balance there. And she always had my back, and she was always very good at telling me when I was getting a little too close to the edge.
Interesting. So I'm having the reverse situation right now. I've always been a very big risk taker in my career. Starting with the tech company I started, to becoming a realtor, and then dating my then girlfriend, who's now my wife. And I was a big time risk taker, right? But now, as I've gotten older and we're married 1 year now, I've taken that risk back, that risk factor way back. And she's telling me that, I guess this is the beautiful thing of having a wife too, with the great communication as you did as well. She's saying you need to start taking more steps, advance your steps on risk. So I guess it's a dance where you got to know where to sway a little bit, right?
So in our careers, of course, particularly if you're in a very difficult environment, the risks can be very high.
Right. Yeah. I'm not going to end up hurt, at least.
There are significant risks to your assets. There are significant risks to yourself and your family, to your coworkers. So there's got to be a balance between risk taking and good security. Later on in my career, we were setting up an initial basically tech startup inside the CIA. And the guy that I was doing it with was a senior scientist from Sandia National Labs. And we were just getting acquainted and having those initial get acquainted conversations. And he said, well, what are some of the biggest risks that you face in your career? And he had kind of technical risks in mind, like losing a capability. And I said, getting killed.
That's crazy. That is scary. Yeah. So that's what I'm talking about. That's why we're so glad to have you on, because you've toed the line on that risk tolerance that can get you killed if you go too much, unfortunately. So you're like the best person to ask. We could ask a businessman, chief of whatever, it could be CEO, but at the same time, they're not going to go through the gravity of a consequence that you can, right? So I think that's yeah. Thank you.
So toward the end of my career, it was my privilege to serve as what the CIA called at the time the chief of our Near East and South Asia division. So that was the entire region of the Near East and South Asia. So given any given day, there were like 25 or 26 stations and bases in that area. And I was in charge of the entire organization. So there were a couple of things that I did in getting to know people along those lines, like when we had people that had just graduated from training and were joining the division. I had at least a half an hour conversation with each one of them. And I said, tell me how you got here. I want to hear your story.
I see.
What was your journey from, to here? Because I want to know you as an individual.
Right. I guess that's a good form of orientation for them and for you. And now, how do you keep that consistently going though with like your senior people that are already there that you've known for so many years? How do you keep the flow of relationship and the conduct of getting a mission done?
These components are like large extended families. And because of the nature of the work you do and the hours that you do them, you actually get to know each other pretty well.
Okay.
And this is particularly true if you're serving in a particular overseas location. You get to know the individual officers very well. You get to know their families very well. Weddings, birthday parties, anniversaries, and in particular, because you tend to be going through a certain set of very challenging circumstances, those bonds become very, very, very strong. So I would say that over a career, because I served almost my entire career in the Near East and South Asia Division, I got to know those people and they got to know me pretty well.
Right.
And that's why I spent time with the new entry on duty people, because we hadn't gotten to know them yet. We were just getting acquainted.
I see. So I guess that's where the loyalty aspect really gets firm, because you become like, to a degree, of family. But where do you toe the line where your privacy with you and your wife and your family needs to be separated from your colleagues, where at many times you're constantly with them, you're going to the birthday parties, as you said. There's other, jobs in business where you work so long that your colleagues become like your family in a way too. You go out to eat with them, you have your wife come over, meet their wife or whatever. How do you know when to separate?
Well, it's kind of common sense.
Is it?
But I got to tell you, given the nature of our work, particularly if we are in a hostile environment, the chief of station does have to be a little bit nosy.
Has to be a little bit what?
Nosy.
Oh.
Because the welfare, not just of the officers of the station, but the officers' families, is part of your responsibility. Because if something goes wrong, either with an officer or a family member,
I didn't think of that.
you're going to be dealing with that situation.
Right.
So, I never wanted to know anything about, their intimate relationships, but I wanted to know that the family was okay.
Okay. That's a lot to oversee then, because you're talking about the family members that aren't CIA or NSA that are going to impact you, unfortunately, if they make the wrong choice of doing something. How did you live up to that stress though? Like, how were you able to go to bed at night? Because I would feel like there'd be complications going to sleep at sometimes, thinking of all the potential issues.
It's an important part of the job. You have to do that well in order to have a good organization, a healthy set of individuals working with you. If you don't, you've got all kinds of issues that you end up dealing with. When it was my privilege to serve as the chief of the Near East and South Asia Division, we would actually hold annual chief of stations conferences. And I would give a charge to the chiefs of station before we broke up at the end of the several-day conference. And my number one charge was take care of your people. Okay. And one of my last overseas assignments, it was a large station overseas. It was a pretty challenging post culturally, socially. And in the summertime, I threw cookouts at my house and invited the families.
Yeah.
And we had watermelon spitting contests.
Oh, that's cool.
And what was I doing? I was counting fingers and toes.
Wow. And I'm sure, so a lot of your colleagues, people, subordinates, however you call them, I know they've been through training and they're excellent people at what they do. They have to be to some degree to get there. Could they tell you were assessing them? And I mean, you were still their boss and their friend, but do you think they could tell it what you were doing as well?
Of course.
Okay.
Because they had the same training and background and instincts that I did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Does it get difficult? I've been thinking a lot of this while sitting here, but you're trained as a CIA officer to lie in case, to prevent anything bad from happening to you, right? Is that a fair assessment? And without giving away a poker face, does that raise any trust issues between you when everyone's that well trained in that?
Oh, that's a good point.
I don't think so. Because I think, inside the compartment, we're pretty open and honest with each other. Again, because we have to rely upon each other so heavily for each other's security and welfare. Again, it comes back to that trust thing again. You can make a lot of mistakes. The one mistake we cannot abide is you're lying to us.
Okay.
And so the trust factor is really, really important. And being fairly transparent with your coworkers is part of that.
So then you have to be vulnerable with each other to some degree. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah. Honor is a large component of it.
Yeah. Now, would you recommend, like, obviously we're not CIA, but like if we have a team, should we be vulnerable with them, our subordinates? And should we do it in a setting with a big group or more on the individual scale? And how much vulnerability should you share as a leader with the other person sitting across the
table? It kind of depends on the size of the component. In my early days, I was in fairly small components, and it was pretty easy to get to know everybody fairly well and quickly. As you rise in seniority, you tend to be in charge of larger and larger and larger components, and therefore doing it all together at once gets to be a lot more prohibitive. So you have to do it in smaller groups.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, because I definitely like to show my sense of my human side too when I'm meeting with people, especially if I'm going to have a team member or partner work with me in my job. You know, I always tell them kind of my weakness and why they're there to kind of overcome that weakness for me. For example, a lot of people think I'm very outgoing, an extrovert. I'm really not. My wife is. I'm not. I don't like public speaking, and I can do it, and I can do it okay. But there's a lot of preparation when I have to do it. At least I try to. So I try and have someone else on my team, per se, or partner, that can do that public speaking for me, and I can just sit back and relax a little bit more comfortably. So,
I mean, that's true of every individual, and it's true of every team.
Okay.
And what you want to do is to have a group of people with different skills, where a particular person can take a lead in a particular area where that person has strong skills in that area.
Do you need to ever share, though, as a leader, what you don't have? I guess you could say what personality trait you may be lacking a little bit, and remind the other person why they're there to overcome that, or is that not necessary?
With coworkers, it never troubled me at all to be fairly transparent.
Okay. Good. So CIA operators are very transparent with one another.
With one another.
Okay. I wasn't sure if that was the case, but it makes sense now the way you put it. So thank you. Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine if you're in a very hostile environment, the difficulties placed upon you and your coworkers are enormous.
Yeah.
And you just have to be able to rely upon them and their judgment and their abilities and their trustworthiness to succeed.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like you really are a family out there then, because you're all watching each other's back. It's like in the military or law enforcement or firefighters. I can see that. Okay. I wanted to see if we can get into, I know you covered earlier about area knowledge and how you were able to learn the cultures of where you were deployed at. But is there any advice on memorizing information and being able to relay that information to the other person or another party? Any type of, like, is it note cards that you do? Like what kind of things can you tell us that you're allowed to tell us?
I think different people have different mechanisms that they use. I will tell you that since we're kind of in a always studying mode, it's perhaps a little easier because you can develop those skills, particularly in learning a language, learning a hard language. There's a lot of memorization that goes on. I mean, you learn the grammar, you figure out the accents and all that kind of stuff, but there's just a lot of memorization. I use a lot of note cards.
Okay.
I used to carry a dictionary around in my hand for years.
Wow.
And I think you can develop that part of the brain to remember more stuff. The other thing that's a critical skill, and I think this has applications for you guys as well, is that when you're assessing someone, you want to know a lot about them. Who are they? What's their background? How did they get where they got? What are their attitudes? What's their family situation? I got very good at, one, eliciting that information from an individual, but also remembering a lot of it. And then going back and reporting it, because that became a component part. If we were going to frame a developmental activity against that individual, knowing as much about that person and that person's motivations was going to be important. So again, that's a skill that you can develop over time.
Okay. I think it was President Bill Clinton. They said, it might not be true. I think it's true though. They said that he knew everyone's name and a little small snippet detail about them. And I believe it's because he had no cards, if I'm not wrong. Have you heard that before?
I mean, different people use different mechanisms. I think over time, you can learn to remember a lot of stuff.
Okay.
And then kind of file it away, either physically or just mentally.
Okay. Chris, I think you wanted to mention about spy gear, garments, ask Jim some questions, and then I'll share some things that I do when I go to places like Mexico.
Actually, I don't think we screened that, so I didn't want to bring it up. But there was a question I had about. We already touched on language a little bit. My question is, I know in the State Department they have like the Foreign Institute where they get people up to speed really quickly on language. Are there similar programs like that for the CIA?
Yes.
Okay.
So the Foreign Service Institute for the State Department is an excellent, basically, university for the State Department. And there are CIA officers who go through FSI programs.
Okay.
I actually went through FSI Arabic many years ago. But the agency also has an entire university of its own where we teach all kinds of courses, operations, analysis, and we have a full language school.
Do you know of any courses we can maybe take as civilians where we can learn languages like that? I mean, there's several of them out there that I can't name off right now, but do you know of any that might be relatively similar and as quality that you kind of went through?
It tends to be language specific. And I really wouldn't recommend the online courses so much. You really need to get enrolled in a good program at a good college or university. I mean, then it can be online.
Why is that? Why can't you do it online? Like everyone nowadays, students, everyone wants to do everything online. Why do you recommend it in person?
Well, the technology can help, but I don't think the technology is a substitute for learning a language. You really need to have muscle memory to do the work, to learn the grammar, to learn the words, to learn the accent. And I don't think just doing it online. I mean, an aspect of it can be online, but I don't think the entire course of study could be online and be very successful. In fact,
right, there's all kind of phrases that are in a language that thinking outside of the box, things like that would make no sense if you just study black and white, right?
So one of the things that we try to do with all of our language students is something we call deep immersion. So that means you're actually living and studying in that culture.
Oh.
And then you're hearing the language all day, every day.
Yeah. That's probably the best way to do it.
And remember I said that language is a cornerstone, but it's also all that other stuff too. It's the history and the sociology and the culture. If you're in a deep immersion situation, you're doing it, all of it. So I actually went through the State Department's FSI Arabic program in a somewhat accelerated fashion because I had grown up in the Middle East as a kid. And I finished early, and what that enabled me to do was I went to the University of Jordan and I audited courses in Arabic for a semester, and I lived with a family. And I allowed myself one English language conversation a week.
Okay, that makes sense. So you kept yourself accountable. What did you tell the family you were doing while you were living with them, learning? Did you say you were just
I was State
student?
Department.
You were what?
State Department.
Okay, got it. Okay, so when you're undercover overseas, any specific spy gear that you could talk about, or concealment garments of some sort?
Sure.
We want to hear it all. If we
So
can.
first of all, I need to dial you back a little bit.
Okay.
If you go back kind of before the 1980s, all of the major U.S. intelligence collection assets, really big ones or small technical ones, were wholly owned and operated by the U.S. government. Right? That's no longer the case today.
I see.
We flew the rockets, we launched the satellites, we flew the satellites. That's all changed. Now the U.S. private sector, in many cases, is the one controlling a lot of those assets,
Right.
or they're doing it on contract with the U.S. government. In terms of more tactical spy gear, back in the early days, all of the devices that we deployed and used were purpose-built for the CIA, either by the government itself or on a contract with a company under a classified contract. And each piece of spy gear was its own separate black box piece of spy gear.
Okay.
And in many cases, it needed its own separate dedicated concealment device. Because when you looked at it, it was a black box device, right?
Right.
And so every device had to have a concealment. Fast forward today, that smartphone that you're carrying around
Yeah.
can do 5 or 6 different things all in one device.
True.
It's a signaling device. It's one or more cameras. It's a couple of different two-way communications devices. It enables you to do research. And that's all produced by the private sector. If I had tried to do all of those things early in my career, I would have been carrying 5 or 6 different devices and probably couldn't have carried all of them at once. Too bulky.
It would have looked awkward for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the technology and the ownership, the development of the technology has really evolved significantly over the years.
With all this evolvement, though, I'm sure you know who Jonah Mendez is. I believe that's how you pronounce it. She wore the face garments or face mask, I guess you could call it, at some point. Do you think they still do that?
So I was going to mention Jana Mendez. So Jana Mendez is the widow of Tony Mendez. And if you and your audience recall the award-winning film Argo,
Yeah.
the true individual played by Ben Affleck is Tony Mendez. It was Tony that actually went into occupied Tehran and helped to disguise and document the 6 Americans that were hiding in the Canadian ambassador's residence and get them out of the country. True story. So both Tony and Jana were in the component of the agency that did disguises. And before the end of her career, Jana was actually the head of a disguise for us. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but she has just come out with a 3rd book called In True Face. And she was actually a featured speaker at our last in-person lunch back in April.
Oh, cool.
And we did an AFIO Now interview with her.
Oh, nice.
The interview has just posted to the AFIO website about the book. What we do is we post them initially to our website for our members to view.
Okay.
And then a few weeks later, we move it to the public side of YouTube.
That's great.
This one has not moved to the public side of YouTube yet, but it will in a few weeks.
Okay. We'll be on the lookout for that. Yeah, that's
But
great.
she talks about the book, and she did disguise stuff her entire career. So it's a great story.
I see. Okay, so even though we have smartphone and things like that, and we may go somewhere outside of the U.S., when I go to Mexico, I like to, I guess, I don't want to carry all my money in my wallet. I want to hide some of it. So there's things I do here and there to try and conceal it. Is there anything you can tell us of what you can do to maybe, I don't know, hide your money, so you don't get it all stolen from someone at one point. You put it in, maybe hide it in the hotel, or, you just don't want everyone to know, the people that you're visiting, the hotel or whatever, you don't want them to know that you're from California at this specific location, that you're around these types of people. Any types of form of advice for us for something like that, especially people that like to travel?
Well, I just wouldn't travel with a lot of cash
Okay.
to start with. In this day and age, you don't really need to.
Right.
You can take all kinds of plastic with you. There are ATMs everywhere. So I think you would be ill-served if you tried taking large amounts of cash with you. You'd be kind of asking for problems. Today, it's not just the theft of your cash, it's the theft of your identity and your various pieces of documentation. So driver's license, passport, credit cards.
Right.
You really need to protect those as well as your cash, because if somebody can actually access that stuff, they can do you more harm.
Right.
So you may not want to take all your credit cards with you
Okay.
if you have a lot. And you may not want to put all of your credit cards or all your documentation in one place. You might want to put it in several different places, right?
Okay.
The other thing that we talk about, and I mean, this is kind of CIA specific, but it certainly can apply to people just traveling overseas, is you really want to be aware of your environment. And particularly if you've been to a place for a while or you've gone back to it on multiple occasions, you kind of get a sense for what's normal and what's not, what feels right and what doesn't feel right. And if something is not normal or doesn't feel right, alarm bells should start going off.
Right.
Something's wrong here. I don't know quite what it is yet, but it just doesn't feel right to me. What do? You walk away.
I see.
And
In my career, on many occasions, myself and other colleagues avoided problems by just walking away from problem areas.
Makes sense.
right. And Jim, actually, I wanted to ask you, I was in Rio recently, and my strategy was I had a dummy wallet. I had a wallet with, useless plastic. It was like a
That's funny.
GNC card, things that I'll never use, right? And it had some money in it, a very small amount. And I was just ready to pass it to someone if someone came and said, "Hey, give me your wallet," or something. And I actually didn't have a real wallet. I just had a dummy wallet and some cash in different pockets and my passport. But what do you think about that strategy?
I think in this day and age, overseas or even in our country, your life is not worth whatever it is you might be carrying in your wallet. So you want to give it up. And so I like your idea of not taking too much stuff or having some dummy stuff that you can easily live without and just surrendering it.
But Jim, sometimes when like, for example, I was in Italy recently, or a year ago, actually. It feels like recently. I wish it was. But sometimes, we're at the hotel. We have our belongings, of course. And then we go on a tour, an hour, 2 miles up with the taxi. Us getting back to the hotel could be almost impossible if we don't know the area. Our phone dies. Someone steals it. Someone steals our money. I think that's why, yes, we definitely will give it up if it's life-threatening. But at the same time, we need to find a way to get back to the hotel per se. So what I like to do when I go on vacation, I usually contact this, I think it's the travel.state.gov, the State Department of, I think it's the Bureau of Consular Affairs. And it basically, they'll constantly send you text messages or emails when there's some terrorism situation going on, so that the U.S. government constantly will contact that civilian with automatic messages, of course, of what's going on, where they're staying. And then they also know where you're at. I think I was able to put what hotel we were at. At the same time, I do like to make friends with the valet guy and the taxi guy. I'm not going to lie. I'm always friendly. Like, my job requires me to be friendly with everyone. And I'm naturally a friendly person. I love talking to people. That's my passion, to make people happy. But I definitely tip them well. And then they like that. And I feel like when I do that, sometimes they feel more loyal to make sure I'm safe. that makes sense.
I would endorse all of those things. The organization that you're talking about at the State Department is called the Overseas Security Advisory Council, OSAC, OSAC.
OSAC, okay.
They have a wonderful website, and they provide a great service to all Americans, both those traveling overseas and family members back home.
Okay.
And yes, they have a series of security alerts and security announcements for every country in the world, every region in the world. And if something starts going down in a particular area, you can very quickly and easily access that information. Almost as important, family members back home who are concerned about you can also access that information. It's a great organization, and it's a good one for American citizens traveling abroad to visit before they go abroad, but certainly have it on their devices when they travel.
OSEC. I'll check that out.
www.osac.gov.
There you go. Everyone who's watching, listening, definitely go check that out. And if you happen to be one like myself that's used it, comment below and let us know what you thought about it, because it was pretty easy to manage and input some information. And Jim, we don't have too much more time. I know you're very busy. I do want to have you cover, hard targets, if you can cover what exactly that meant. And I think you said non-targets is the other one.
Yeah. So I need to scroll you back a little bit to before the fall of the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the traditional hard targets were the USSR, the East Bloc, China, North Korea. And we actually worked very aggressively against all of those targets. They were hard targets, but what it made it somewhat easier is that almost everybody that we would be interested in worked in some kind of government office, either in the nation's capital or a large city. And so it was easier for us to focus our efforts and our activities on those subsets. And we spent a lot of time and effort figuring out, what's the information that we need to know, where does it repose, who are the individuals that might have that information, and how do we, identify them and go after them. It was hard, but there was some structure to it, and we did a good job of addressing that structure.
I see.
As the Cold War was winding down, a whole new set of what I call non-traditional targets had been around, but they really began to emerge with a vengeance. And that is terrorism, narcotics trafficking, and weapons of mass destruction.
Okay.
And those targets were very different. By and large, those people didn't work out of government offices.
Yeah.
They weren't in capital cities. They quite often were in remote places, and the actual places were quite often hidden to include underground.
Wow.
This meant that we had to develop a whole new set of tactics and capabilities to go against those new non-traditional targets.
Okay. So that's what it is.
It's not impossible, but it takes different people with different backgrounds and skills, different mechanisms to go after those targets.
I guess that's where it comes in, where that clandestine skill set and service that you have people doing on the ground, that's probably where it becomes even more crucial when it's those non-targets.
And let's take terrorism just for a moment, because that's so much in the news these days. Quite often the members of a terrorist organization, one, they're highly committed, but quite often they are members of the same social group, members of the same tribe, clan, even family.
Right.
So 6'2" Anglo-Saxon Jim Hughes doesn't just go walking in
Yeah.
and say, howdy.
Yeah, you'll stick out like a sore thumb for sure.
So you have to come up with all new mechanisms, new approaches. We have done it successfully, but it's a different way to solve the problem.
We saw that with Andrew Bustamante, the former CIA operator. he was saying something along the lines like, during World War II, OSS, before CIA, and then during the Cold War, the demographic of CIA officers overseas were different then. Until the war started changing and shifting, they had to get different types of individuals that had different pigmentation of skin, different backgrounds. So that makes sense. It looks like constantly having to do that.
We actually talked about this in an interview that I did on Thursday. So these programs of diversity hiring actually began way back in the 90s.
Okay.
For that particular reason. Because even though I spoke near native Arabic, you could not send me into certain situations.
Yeah.
I would be a red flag.
Right.
So we were already actively, aggressively hiring Americans from all different backgrounds, religious, social, cultural, who could blend in a lot better into some of those different environments. And we've been very successful at that.
I'm glad to hear that, because at the end of the day, they're there to protect us, civilians, and America. And that's why it's an honor to have you. We greatly appreciate you. We have 2 more questions for you as we wrap up. One being, has the CIA's mission, the agency's mission, shifted a lot, or maybe not at all, since you started, from now till today? What do you say?
Well, yeah, it's shifted several times. One, the end of the Cold War and the emergence of these new non-traditional targets was a fairly significant shift.
Okay.
The war on terrorism caused us to adjust significantly because we were putting very large numbers of people into combat zones, working closely with the U.S. military.
Yeah.
That was a significant challenge. And then the technology has been the other challenge, and I know that that's an ongoing challenge today because back in the 70s and 80s, it was pretty easy for me to disappear and become anonymous.
Yeah, that must have been the day, man, to be able to
Today,
do
with
that.
social media, biometric markers, and everybody, not just governments, but hotels and airlines and car rental agencies,
There's cameras everywhere.
Everybody collecting information on you.
Yeah.
You really aren't anonymous anymore. And so working within that new social media technology environment has become much more challenging. Not impossible, but just takes a lot more time and effort and preparation.
I have a thing about which I dislike, and I'll get into it maybe next time we have you on, but I don't like where my facial recognition has to be done. I still don't do it on my iPhone, but at the end of the day, I'm like, well, I'm already screwed. I went to Disneyland a month ago and they have to do it for whatever reason. They require it. And it really bugs me, the whole privacy thing. But anyways, just wanted to share that snippet. But what would you say was the most rewarding thing about being at CIA? Like, what makes you happy about it?
Well, it's a great organization. It's a great opportunity to serve the nation, and the people are amazing.
Mm.
And so for me, there was just never a bad day. Every day was interesting. Every day was challenging. Every day there was something new to deal with. I mean, we have certain basic skills and backgrounds, but almost every new situation that we were thrown into was a new situation.
Yeah. Well, every day was a good day, you said, for the most part, right? But was there ever a close call that made it not almost a good day when you were?
Well, I mean, we lose colleagues.
Yeah.
And those are very bad days.
Right. But does it happen is it like the movies where it can happen often, or does it hopefully not happen so often as we would suspect?
There are just over 140 stars on the wall.
Okay. Yeah, I see.
And how many years? Is it like 60 years?
We just had our 75th anniversary 2 years ago.
75th.
Yeah, because it was somewhat right after the World War II, right? With OSS.
1947, September.
Nice.
President Truman signed the National Security Act.
That's good. Jim, we definitely want to have you on again. We hope that you're willing to come back on again. We'll probably tailor it more to current affairs, what's going on right now in the world, whatever you could talk about. But I want people that are watching today to know how to find you. President of AFIO, if you want to throw something out there of how they can find you, that'd be great right now.
I'd be happy to. So it's the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, www.afio.com. We have always been in the public information business, particularly for academics. There are several very good online publications that we do that might be of interest to some of your audience. Mm-hmm. One is an online booklet called Careers in Intelligence, which actually describes all 17 of the U.S. intelligence agencies, what they do, the skill sets that they're looking for new hires, how to apply. The other one is more for academics, and it's also online. It's called A Guide to the Study of Intelligence. It's about 80 articles written by about 50 of our members on a whole variety of academic subjects, and particularly good for both professors and students. And then, as you know, since the pandemic began, we've been doing a series that we call AFIO Now, which are video recordings that we post initially to the AFIO website for our members to view. But then after a few weeks, we post them to the public side of YouTube, and we create a podcast. And we're on 8 different podcast platforms. And most of the interviews are with former U.S. intelligence officers or authors who write about intelligence.
Excellent. And those who are watching and listening, I can attest to how great those videos are, those podcast episodes that you do. You're a great host and you have phenomenal people on. So it'll be to your advantage to listen and watch Jim Hughes at AFIO Now. Everyone, thank you for being on Full Count Podcast. Comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.